Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will absolutely destroy any romantic notions you might have about ancient Rome. You've seen the movies, the noble gladiators, the wise senators, the glorious empire. But what Hollywood conveniently glosses over is the industrial-scale brutality that made Rome function. We're talking about a civilization that turned human suffering into both an art form and a bureaucratic process. Tonight, we're diving deep into the world of Roman torturers, executioners, and the machinery of state-sanctioned cruelty that would make modern horror films look like children's cartoons. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're about to explore the darkest corners of human history together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, because you're going to need all the comfort you can get. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a journey into the systematic brutalization of human beings that formed the backbone of the world's most famous empire. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Though I warn you, sleep might be elusive after this one. You wake up at dawn in a cramped apartment above a bakery in the Suburra district of Rome, 73 AD. The smell of fresh bread should be comforting, but it's overwhelmed by the metallic stench that seems permanently embedded in your clothing, your hair, your very skin. You're 22 years old, and you've been working as an assistant to Marcus Lucius Torquatus, Rome's most efficient state torturer, for 3 years now. Today marks your final evaluation, the day you either become a full torturer yourself or end up as practice material for someone else. The path to becoming a Roman torturer wasn't something you chose from a career fair. Most torturers were either former soldiers who'd shown particular enthusiasm for interrogation, slaves who'd demonstrated useful skills, or citizens who'd fallen into debt and needed guaranteed imperial employment. The job paid well, 3 times what a common laborer earned, but the psychological toll was evident in every torturer's face. You'd noticed how they all developed the same hollow stare, the same nervous tic of constantly washing their hands, even when they weren't visibly dirty. Your training began with observation. For 6 months, you simply watched. You learned that effective torture wasn't about rage or sadism. It was about calculated precision. Marcus taught you that the goal wasn't to cause maximum pain, but to extract information while keeping the subject alive and coherent. A dead man tells no secrets, he'd say, methodically sharpening his instruments. And a screening man tells only what he thinks you want to hear. The tools of your trade were surprisingly sophisticated. The Romans had been perfecting torture techniques for centuries, and by the imperial period, they'd developed instruments that would have impressed medieval inquisitors. The scourge, a whip with metal balls and sheep bones woven into the leather strips, was designed to tear flesh without immediately causing fatal bleeding. The rack could dislocate joints with measured precision. The strappado could suspend a victim by their arms tied behind their back, slowly pulling shoulder joints apart while maintaining consciousness through carefully administered stimulants. But the most disturbing part of your training wasn't learning to use these instruments. It was learning to read people. Marcus taught you to recognize the exact moment when someone's resistance would break, not through their screams, but through subtle changes in breathing, eye movement, and muscle tension. You learned that different people broke in different ways. Soldiers typically held out longer, but collapsed more completely, while merchants often cracked quickly but tried to bargain. Women, contrary to popular belief, often proved more resistant than men, particularly mothers who believed they were protecting their children. The psychological conditioning was gradual but thorough. Your first month involved only cleaning instruments and preparing the interrogation chamber. The second month, you assisted with restraints. By the third month, you were applying minor pressure techniques under supervision. The progression was designed to gradually erode your natural human empathy, replacing it with professional detachment. The state couldn't afford torturers who hesitated or suffered emotional breakdowns during critical interrogations. Your workspace was a stone chamber beneath the Tulliam prison, carved directly into the bedrock of the Capitoline Hill. The walls wept constantly with moisture, creating an atmosphere that amplified every sound. The Romans had deliberately designed the space to be psychologically oppressive. Low ceilings, no natural light, and drainage channels that carried away blood that left permanent stains. The chamber's acoustics were perfect for carrying screams to other cells, serving as psychological warfare against prisoners awaiting their turn. Today's final test involves a captured Germanic spy who's refused to reveal troop movements for 2 weeks. Standard interrogation has failed, and tomorrow, General Vespasian needs those numbers for his campaign strategy. Marcus hands you the lead role while he observes. Your hands don't shake as you prepare the instruments. That's a good sign. Shaking hands indicate either fear or excitement, both of which interfere with precision work. The spy is a woman in her 30s, muscular and scarred from previous battles. Her eyes hold the particular defiance you've learned to recognize in career soldiers. She's calculated that death is preferable to betraying her people, which means standard pain techniques won't work. You'll need to find another pressure point, perhaps threatening to send her to the slavers instead of granting the quick death she expects. As you begin the session, you realize that 3 years of training have fundamentally changed you. The person who would have vomited at the sight of deliberate human suffering no longer exists. In their place stands someone who can systematically break another human being while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to do the job effectively. The transformation wasn't sudden. It happened one small compromise at a time, each day chipping away at your humanity until only professional competence remained. Marcus watches approvingly as you work. You've learned to read pain like a language, adjusting pressure and technique based on the subject's responses. You know exactly how much damage you can inflict before permanent injury occurs, how to maintain consciousness during extreme stress, and how to exploit psychological vulnerabilities that are often more effective than physical torture. The irony isn't lost on you that Rome's greatest strength, its bureaucratic efficiency, has been applied to the systematic destruction of human dignity. You're not a sadistic monster. You're a skilled professional performing a necessary state function. That realization is somehow more disturbing than if you'd simply been a psychopath. The Empire has created a system that turns ordinary people into instruments of controlled brutality, and you've become living proof that with enough gradual conditioning, almost anyone can be taught to inflict unthinkable suffering. By evening, you've extracted the troop movements and earned Marcus's approval for full promotion. Tonight, you'll celebrate with wine and the knowledge that you've secured steady employment in an unstable world. But you'll also lie awake, knowing that tomorrow brings another prisoner, another session, another small piece of your soul fed to the Empire's insatiable appetite for control through fear. The Colosseum's hidden machinery of death. You arrive at the Flavern Amphitheater, what later generations will call the Colosseum, 2 hours before dawn, 96 AD. As the chief coordinator of special events, you're responsible for ensuring that today's games run smoothly. The Emperor Domitian has promised the crowd something spectacular: the public execution of 200 captured Dacian prisoners, followed by beast hunts featuring lions, tigers, and bears, imported at enormous expense from across the empire. What the cheering crowd above won't see is the industrial-scale killing machine operating beneath their feet. The Hypogeum, the underground complex beneath the arena floor, is a masterpiece of engineering that would impress modern architects. Stretching across 2 levels, it contains a maze of corridors, animal cages, prisoner cells, and mechanical lift systems that can raise men. Beasts or elaborate stage sets into the arena in seconds. The Romans didn't just want to kill people. They wanted to do it with theatrical flair that would leave audiences talking for months. Your workspace this morning is a cramped office carved into the stone, filled with wax tablets listing the day's schedule. 200 prisoners means careful timing. You can't have them all die too quickly, or the crowd will grow bored. But you also can't drag individual executions out too long, or you'll fall behind schedule and face the Emperor's wrath. The mathematics of mass murder require precise calculation. 15 crucifixions, 50 fed to animals, 35 gladiatorial combat executions, and 100 condemned to fight as Noxi, prisoners forced to battle without armor or proper weapons. The prisoners arrived yesterday evening, chained in groups and herded into holding cells barely large enough for half their number. Most haven't eaten in 3 days. Hungry prisoners move more slowly, making them easier to manage, and their desperation creates better entertainment value. You can hear them through the stone walls, some praying to gods that won't answer, others weeping, a few maintaining the stoic silence that warriors adopt when facing inevitable death. The animal handlers are already at work, using long iron prods to move the beasts into position. The lions are kept deliberately hungry and agitated. A well-fed lion might simply ignore human prey, which would ruin the spectacle. The trainers have developed techniques for maximizing aggression, confining animals in spaces too small for comfort, using noise and bright lights to induce stress, and introducing unfamiliar scents to trigger territorial responses. What the crowd sees as natural predator behavior is actually carefully manufactured savagery. Your first task involves selecting which prisoners will die in which manner. This isn't random. It's strategic theater. The youngest and strongest will be saved for gladiatorial combat, where their struggles will last longest and provide maximum entertainment. The elderly and infirm go to the beasts, where their quick deaths serve as appetizers for the main events. Women and children, yes children, are reserved for the most elaborate executions, often reenacting famous mythological scenes where the condemned play roles that require them to die in specific ways. The lifting mechanisms represent Roman engineering at its most sophisticated and morally bankrupt. Counterweight systems can raise a full-grown lion and its human prey from the basement to arena level in under 10 seconds. Trapdoors can open beneath condemned prisoners' feet, dropping them into predetermined scenarios. Perhaps a pit filled with wild dogs, or a chamber where they'll face armed gladiators while remaining unarmed themselves. The crowd above sees only the sudden appearance of dramatic tableau, unaware of the complex machinery required to create these spontaneous moments of terror. Today's specialty is Damnatio ad Bestias, condemnation to the beasts, which requires careful choreography. The animals must be released at precisely the right moment to catch prisoners who've been given just enough head start to make their pursuit entertaining. Guards with long spears stand ready to redirect beasts that move toward arena walls instead of their intended prey. Backup animals wait in adjacent cages in case the first wave kills too quickly or, worse, refuses to attack at all. The prisoners scheduled for crucifixion present their own logistical challenges. Traditional crucifixion takes hours or even days, but arena crowds want faster gratification. Your team has developed Arena Crucifixion, a modified version, where the condemned are nailed to crossbeams that can be raised and lowered, allowing for theatrical presentation while ensuring death occurs within a reasonable time frame. The crosses are pre-positioned around the arena's perimeter, creating a macabre border for the day's other entertainments. Between executions, you coordinate the removal of bodies and the spreading of fresh sand to absorb blood. The arena floor requires constant maintenance. Too much blood creates slippery conditions that interfere with subsequent events, while insufficient cleanup leaves visible evidence of previous deaths that might disturb the crowd's enjoyment. Specialized slaves work with remarkable efficiency, clearing corpses and refreshing the performance space between acts like stagehands in a theater. The crowd psychology fascinates and horrifies you in equal measure. From your position in the hypogeum, you can hear their reactions through stone and wood. The collective intake of breath when a lion leaps, the roar of approval when a prisoner falls, the rhythmic chanting that demands more spectacular deaths. These aren't bloodthirsty monsters. They're ordinary citizens, craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers who've been conditioned to view human suffering as entertainment. What disturbs you most is the efficiency of it all. Rome has industrialized murder, turning the taking of human life into a smoothly operating bureaucracy. Your job exists because the empire has determined that public executions serve important political functions. They demonstrate state power, provide outlet for social tensions, and reinforce the consequences of opposing Roman authority. You're not just a coordinator of deaths. You're an instrument of imperial policy. As the morning progresses and the first prisoners are lifted into the arena above, you realize that you've become complicit in something that transcends individual cruelty. The Colosseum represents civilization's capacity to systematize and celebrate its own moral bankruptcy. Every gear, pulley, and drainage channel has been designed to facilitate the transformation of human beings into entertainment. And you're the person who makes it all run on schedule. The worst part? You're good at your job. The Emperor regularly commends your efficiency, and your innovations in staging executions have been copied in amphitheaters across the empire. You found ways to make death more theatrical, suffering more prolonged, and the entire spectacle more memorable for audiences. In trying to simply do your job well, you've become an architect of industrialized inhumanity. Life and death in the Roman slave markets. You stand in the Forum Boarium at first light, 117 AD, watching as 300 newly arrived slaves are prepared for today's auction. As the Preco, the chief auctioneer for Gaius Flavius, Maximus's slave trading operation, you're responsible for presenting human beings as commodities to be evaluated, purchased, and consumed. The morning air carries the scent of olive oil used to make their skin gleam and the chalk powder applied to their feet, marking them as foreign property. What you're about to witness and orchestrate would be classified as crimes against humanity in any modern context. But in Hadrian's Rome, it's simply another day's business. The slaves arrived yesterday after a 6-week journey from Gaul, chained in groups and force-marched from the ports of Ostia. Half are prisoners of war captured during recent border campaigns. The others are debt slaves, criminals, or people who simply lived in the wrong village when Roman troops needed to meet their quota. They've been sorted by your assistants into categories that determine their market value and expected lifespan. Agricultural workers, household servants, skilled craftsmen, gladiator candidates, and what the euphemistic sales documents call personal service providers. Your first task involves the morning preparation ritual that transforms people into products. Male slaves are stripped, shaved, and oiled to highlight muscle definition. Scars that might indicate previous rebellion are covered with makeup, while scars that suggest military experience are emphasized as selling points. Women undergo more invasive preparation. They're examined for virginity, pregnancy, and disease, with the results recorded on small placards hung around their necks. Children as young as 7 are included in the general inventory, their youth commanding premium prices from buyers seeking long-term investments. The auction platform has been designed for maximum psychological impact on both buyers and merchandise. Elevated 3 feet above the crowd, it ensures clear visibility while creating a sense of vulnerability for those being sold. The wooden planks are fitted with iron rings for restraints, and the platform can be rotated to allow 360-degree inspection of human property. Beneath your feet, you can feel the trembling of today's first lot, a family of Germanic tribespeople who've been kept together solely to increase their combined sale price through the emotional manipulation of separation. Roman lore regarding slave treatment is simultaneously sophisticated and utterly depraved. Slaves are considered res things with the same legal status as livestock or furniture. An owner can legally kill, torture, or sexually assault their property without legal consequence, provided they don't damage someone else's slave without compensation. Yet the law also recognizes slaves' capacity for skill, loyalty, and even affection. creating a cognitive dissonance that allows Romans to simultaneously love and brutalize the same individuals. Your role requires intimate knowledge of buyer psychology and market manipulation. Wealthy households seek different qualities than gladiator schools or agricultural estates. The senator's wife shopping for a personal attendant wants beauty, intelligence, and cultural refinement. A mining operation needs physical strength and resignation to early death. Brothel owners evaluate merchandise with clinical detachment, calculating potential earnings against purchase price and expected working lifespan. You've learned to present the same person differently, depending on your audience, emphasizing or concealing traits based on market demand. The pricing structure reflects Rome's casual attitude toward human life. A healthy adult male agricultural slave costs about the same as a good horse, roughly 2,000 denarii. Skilled craftsmen command higher prices, while children are often sold at bulk discounts since their usefulness requires years of investment. Gladiator candidates represent the highest value category, not because their lives are valued, but because their deaths can be monetized through arena entertainment. The most expensive slaves are those trained in luxury services. Cooks, musicians, teachers, and concubines whose specialized skills justify premium pricing. The auction process itself is theater designed to maximize both prices and psychological trauma. Families are deliberately separated, with children sold first while parents watch helplessly. This serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates absolute control over the merchandise, creates emotional urgency among sympathetic buyers, and establishes the hopelessness that facilitates future compliance. You've developed techniques for managing the crowd's energy, building bidding frenzies for premium lots while moving quickly through less valuable inventory. Today's most disturbing moment involves the sale of skilled craftsmen captured from a Gallic metalworking community. These are educated men who spoke Latin, understood Roman engineering, and lived in comfortable homes before their capture. Now, they stand naked on your platform while buyers examine their hands for calluses, test their knowledge through shouted questions, and debate their potential productivity under various working conditions. The transformation from citizen to property happened so quickly that some still seem unable to grasp their situation. The paperwork involved in slave trading reveals Rome's bureaucratic approach to human commodification. Every transaction requires documentation: bills of sale, health certificates, skill assessments, and behavioral evaluations. The empire maintains detailed records of slave movements, not from humanitarian concern, but to track valuable property and prevent theft. You spend hours each week updating inventories, recording deaths, and calculating profit margins on human investments. What strikes you most forcefully is the casual nature of it all. Buyers discuss slaves' merits while snacking on honey cakes. Children play games between the auction blocks, and merchants negotiate terms as casually as they would for grain or pottery. The normalization of human trafficking has reached such complete cultural acceptance that questioning it would mark someone as eccentric or potentially subversive. The aftermath of auctions presents its own horrors. Unsold slaves, those deemed too old, sick, or otherwise unmarketable, face summary execution or abandonment. Rome's economics don't support charity toward property that can't generate profit. New owners often arrive with restraints and transportation devices that reveal their intended use: chains for mine workers, ornate collars for household servants, brands for agricultural laborers who might attempt escape. As the day progresses and your voice grows hoarse from calling bids, you're struck by the realization that you've facilitated the destruction of hundreds of lives while conducting what Roman society considers honest business. Every sale represents a human being reduced to their economic utility. Every transaction marks another step in the systematic dehumanization that allows civilization to function through institutionalized cruelty. The empire's prosperity depends entirely on slave labor, and your role as auctioneer makes you a crucial component in the machinery that transforms conquered peoples into the human fuel that powers Roman greatness. Tonight, you'll count your commission and plan tomorrow's inventory, knowing that your professional success is measured in the currency of human misery. The science and spectacle of Roman crucifixion. You arrive at the executioner's staging area outside Rome's walls at dawn, 134 AD. As the centurion responsible for today's mass crucifixion, you're overseeing the execution of 43 criminals and political prisoners condemned by imperial decree. The crosses have been prepared overnight, standing in 2 neat rows along the Via Appia like a grotesque forest of Roman justice. What most people don't realize is that crucifixion isn't simply a method of execution. It's a carefully engineered form of torture designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle while sending unmistakable political messages to anyone considering opposition to imperial authority. Your team consists of 8 legionnaires, 2 military physicians, and a dozen auxiliary soldiers responsible for crowd control and body removal. The physicians aren't here for humanitarian reasons. They ensure that condemned prisoners survive long enough for the execution to serve its deterrent purpose. Roman crucifixion is calculated torture, and premature death defeats the entire point of choosing this particular method of execution. The condemned have been held in underground cells for 3 days, deliberately weakened through minimal food and water, but kept alive enough to endure the prolonged dying process. They range from common thieves to captured rebel leaders, but all will receive the same treatment. Roman law makes no distinction based on the nature of crimes when it comes to crucifixion. The method itself is considered appropriate punishment for anyone whose actions challenge state authority. The crosses themselves represent sophisticated engineering designed to optimize suffering. Standing 12 feet tall, they're constructed from seasoned oak that won't splinter under a victim's weight. The vertical post, the stipes, remains permanently mounted along the execution route, while the horizontal crossbeam, the patibulum, can be carried by the condemned to their assigned position. This serves both practical and psychological purposes. It forces victims to participate in their own execution, while conserving Roman resources through reusable infrastructure. The nailing process follows medical principles that Romans have perfected through centuries of practice. The nails, thick iron spikes roughly 7 inches long, are driven through the wrists rather than paws, which lack sufficient structural support for prolonged suspension. The placement targets the space between radius and ulna bones, severing the median nerve and causing excruciating pain while maintaining structural integrity. Foot placement varies based on the intended duration of suffering. Feet nailed separately prolong life by allowing breathing adjustments, while feet nailed together accelerate death through restricted circulation. What makes Roman crucifixion particularly horrific is its deliberate inefficiency as a killing method. Death typically occurs through a combination of shock, dehydration, and asphyxiation that can take anywhere from 3 hours to 3 days. The position prevents normal breathing by pulling the victim's arms upward and forward, forcing them to push against the nails in their feet to lift their chest enough for each breath. This creates a cycle of agony where the simple act of breathing becomes torture, and unconsciousness offers only temporary relief. Your first victim today is Marcus Junius Calvus, a former Roman citizen convicted of sedition for organizing tax protests in Gaul. The loss of citizenship means he's now subject to crucifixion despite his previous status. As your soldiers strip him naked, nudity being part of the humiliation, you can see that he understands exactly what's coming. Roman citizens learn about crucifixion as children, both as deterrent and as source of pride in belonging to a people powerful enough to inflict such suffering on their enemies. The scourging that precedes crucifixion serves multiple purposes beyond simple cruelty. The flagrum, a multi-tailed whip embedded with metal balls and sheep bones, tears flesh in patterns designed to weaken the victim without causing immediate death. The resulting blood loss and shock make the condemned more compliant during the nailing process, while ensuring they'll die faster once crucified. Physicians monitor the scourging to ensure optimal damage, enough to facilitate death within reasonable timeframes, not so much that the victim expires before reaching their cross. The procession to the execution site has been choreographed for maximum psychological impact on both the condemned and watching crowds. Each victim carries their own patibulum, which weighs approximately 40 pounds and creates visible strain when shouldered by weakened prisoners. The route passes through populated areas where citizens can witness imperial justice in action. Guards with whips ensure that anyone who stumbles continues moving, while preventing sympathizers from interfering with the proceedings. The actual crucifixion process reveals Roman engineering applied to human destruction. Victims are laid on the ground, with arms stretched across the patibulum while nails are hammered through their wrists. The sound, metal striking bone, carries clearly across the execution ground, serving as psychological torture for those awaiting their turn. Once secured to the crossbeam, the victim is hoisted using pulleys and ropes until the patibulum slots in the notches carved in the vertical post. Finally, the feet are positioned and nailed, completing the transformation from person to dying exhibit. Crowd management during mass crucifixions requires careful planning. Public executions serve imperial propaganda purposes, but they can also inspire sympathy or rebellion if mishandled. You've positioned guards to prevent attempted rescue while allowing enough public access to ensure the deterrent message spreads throughout the city. Vendors sell food and drinks to spectators who might spend hours watching the condemned die. Turning execution into entertainment that generates economic activity alongside political messaging. The most disturbing aspect of your job is monitoring the dying process to ensure it proceeds according to schedule. Some victims die within hours, while others might survive into a second day. Imperial policy requires that crucified criminals remain on their crosses until death occurs naturally, but practical considerations sometimes necessitate acceleration. The crurifragium, breaking the victim's legs with iron clubs, prevents them from pushing up to breathe, causing rapid death through asphyxiation. Medical observation during crucifixion has taught Roman physicians disturbing lessons about human physiology under extreme stress. They've documented how dehydration affects consciousness, mapped the progression of shock through prolonged pain, and identified the specific combination of factors that determines time until death. This knowledge isn't academic curiosity. It's applied research, designed to optimize torture techniques for maximum effectiveness. As afternoon progresses and several victims have already died, you're struck by the bureaucratic nature of mass execution. Every death requires documentation, time of expiration, physical condition at death, any final words deemed politically significant. The Empire maintains detailed records of crucifixions, tracking their effectiveness as deterrents and refining techniques based on observed results. You're not just an executioner. You're a data collector in Rome's systematic study of institutionalized cruelty. The bodies will remain on their crosses for days after death, serving as warnings to anyone considering criminal activity or political opposition. Eventually, they'll be removed and dumped in common graves outside the city walls, but not before decomposition has made the sight and smell sufficiently repulsive to reinforce the deterrent message. Rome understands that effective terror requires both immediate impact and lasting reminders of imperial power. Tonight, you'll file your reports and prepare for tomorrow's executions, knowing that your professional competence is measured by your ability to orchestrate human suffering with maximum efficiency. The Empire has turned death into both science and spectacle, and you've become its most skilled practitioner. Inside the Roman military's culture of brutality, you stand at attention in the Castra outside Dacia, 106 AD, as Centurion Lucius Domitius Corvus prepares to demonstrate military discipline to your cohort. 3 soldiers from the 2nd century have been caught sleeping on sentry duty during last night's watch. In civilian life, this might warrant dismissal or demotion. In the Roman army, it's a capital offense that threatens not just the guilty parties, but potentially every 10th man in their unit. What you're about to witness isn't an aberration or excess of individual cruelty. It's the systematic application of terror that keeps Roman legions functioning as history's most effective killing machine. The Roman military operates on the principle that fear of punishment must exceed fear of the enemy. Soldiers who might hesitate to charge Germanic warriors or Gallic cavalry must never hesitate to obey Roman commands. This requires a discipline system so ruthlessly applied that death in battle becomes preferable to facing military justice. As a junior officer, you've been trained to view brutal punishment not as cruelty, but as essential maintenance of the institutional terror that makes Roman conquest possible. The three condemned soldiers, Gaius Valerius Maximus, Marcus Antonius Felix, and Lucius Cornelius Rufus, kneel in the center of a hollow square formed by their cohort. They've been stripped to loincloths and bound with ropes that will prevent any attempt at escape or self-inflicted death. Roman military law considers both actions additional offenses punishable by extended torture before execution. The men show varying responses to their situation. Maximus maintains stoic dignity, Felix weeps openly, and Rufus has already soiled himself from terror. Decimation, the execution of every 10th man selected by lot, remains the ultimate collective punishment. But today's offense doesn't warrant such extreme measures. Instead, Corvus has ordered fustuarium. The condemned will be beaten to death by their own comrades using wooden staffs. This serves multiple purposes. It forces the unit to participate in the execution, eliminates any possibility of sympathy or future solidarity with the victims, and demonstrates that mercy is not a Roman military virtue. The psychology behind fustuarium reveals sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and behavioral conditioning. By forcing soldiers to kill their own comrades, the army breaks down personal bonds that might interfere with absolute obedience. Men who've beaten their tent mates to death won't risk similar punishment through future disobedience. The shared guilt creates unit cohesion based on mutual complicity rather than affection or trust. Your fellow soldiers receive their wooden clubs, hastily cut branches thick enough to break bones, but not so heavy as to cause immediate death. The goal is prolonged suffering that maximizes both the victim's agony and the psychological impact on those forced to administer it. Corvus has positioned himself where he can observe every soldier's performance, noting any hesitation or insufficient enthusiasm for future disciplinary action. The first blows fall with the mechanical rhythm that characterizes Roman military efficiency. Maximus, the veteran, endures the initial beating with grim silence, but as ribs crack and internal bleeding begins, his composure breaks into screams that echo across the camp. Felix attempts to curl into a defensive position, but the circle of attackers prevents any protection. Rufus loses consciousness early, though the beating continues until Corvus determines that death has occurred. What makes this scene particularly disturbing is its bureaucratic normality. Military clerks record the proceedings for official reports, noting the time of death, the weapons used, and the names of soldiers who administered punishment. The army maintains detailed documentation of disciplinary actions, tracking their effectiveness as deterrence and refining techniques based on observed results. You're witnessing institutionalized murder dressed as administrative procedure. The broader context of Roman military brutality extends far beyond internal discipline. Conquest itself involves systematic destruction of enemy populations through tactics designed to terrorize survivors into submission. The Army's standard operating procedure includes mass enslavement, public executions of leaders, and deliberate targeting of non-combatants to break enemy morale. What civilians see as war crimes, Roman military doctrine considers effective strategy. Your training included instruction in interrogation techniques that would be classified as torture by any modern standard. Prisoners of war aren't protected by international conventions that won't exist for another 2 millennia. Instead, they're sources of intelligence to be exploited through whatever means prove most effective. You've learned to apply pressure to joints, wounds, and psychological vulnerabilities with the same systematic approach used for mastering sword techniques or siege engineering. The aftermath of battles reveals the Roman army's approach to human life as expendable resource. Wounded enemies aren't treated. They're dispatched with casual efficiency to prevent them from recovering and fighting again. Civilians caught in war zones face summary execution, enslavement, or abandonment based entirely on their perceived value to Roman interests. Children might be spared for slave markets, while elderly populations are typically killed outright as economically worthless. Camp followers, the prostitutes, merchants, and families that travel with Roman armies exist in a legal gray area that makes them vulnerable to exploitation without recourse. Soldiers can rape, rob, or murder camp followers with minimal consequences, provided it doesn't interfere with military operations. The army considers such violence normal stress relief that actually improves military effectiveness by providing outlets for aggression that might otherwise target officers or fellow soldiers. The Legion's medical corps operates with the same calculated brutality that characterizes other military functions. Field surgeons amputate limbs without anesthesia, treating soldiers as equipment to be repaired or discarded based on their continued usefulness. Wounded men who can't return to active duty face discharge without pensions, leaving them to survive as best they can with whatever disabilities they've acquired in imperial service. Supply operations involve systematic pillaging of conquered territories that reduces entire populations to starvation. The army requires enormous quantities of food, materials, and labor that are extracted from local populations through requisitions that amount to organized theft. Roman logistics depend on the assumption that conquered peoples exist solely to support military operations, regardless of the human cost. As evening approaches and the execution detail cleans blood from the parade ground, you're struck by how thoroughly the Roman military has systematized violence as an administrative function. Every aspect of army life involves the casual application of cruelty to achieve institutional objectives. The Empire has created a machine that transforms ordinary men into instruments of organized brutality, and you've become living proof that with sufficient conditioning, anyone can be taught to participate in systematized inhumanity. Tonight, you'll sleep in quarters built by slave labor, eat food stolen from conquered peoples, and dream whatever dreams come to someone who spent their day watching men beaten to death for the crime of falling asleep. Tomorrow brings more training in the application of violence as imperial policy, and your professional advancement depends on demonstrating increasing competence in the systematic destruction of human life. The Roman army isn't just a military force, it's a cultural institution that spreads the Empire's particular brand of organized cruelty across 3 continents. And you've become one of its willing instruments. The Emperor's personal executioners. You stand in the shadow of the Palatine Hill at midnight, 211 AD, waiting for orders from Praetorian Prefect Quintus Aemilius Letus. As one of Emperor Caracalla's speculators, the Imperial Special Forces responsible for state-sanctioned assassinations, torture, and disappearances. You've spent the last 5 years carrying out missions that officially never happened. Tonight's target is Senator Marcus Junius Silanus, whose recent speeches in the Senate have been deemed insufficiently supportive of the Emperor's policies. What you're about to do isn't murder in any legal sense. It's the application of imperial prerogative that exists beyond the reach of law, morality, or human decency. The speculators operate as the Emperor's personal killing squad, recruited from the most ruthless and reliable soldiers in the Praetorian Guard. Your unit consists of men who've demonstrated not just military competence, but psychological traits that make them suitable for missions requiring absolute moral flexibility. You've been selected because you can kill without hesitation, torture without emotional involvement, and maintain perfect silence about operations that could destabilize the Empire if they became public knowledge. Your training included techniques that would horrify professional assassins from any other era. Roman speculators don't simply kill targets. They orchestrate deaths that serve broader political purposes. Sometimes, a prominent citizen needs to die in a way that appears natural, preserving imperial deniability while sending subtle warnings to other potential dissidents. Other times, public figures must disappear completely, their absence creating uncertainty that's more politically useful than confirmed death. Tonight's mission requires a staged accident that will allow Caracalla to express public grief while privately celebrating the elimination of a political obstacle. Sealness must die in a manner that appears accidental, but sends unmistakable messages to anyone else considering public criticism of imperial policies. The emperor's instructions were characteristically direct. Make it look like robbery, but ensure everyone understands what really happened. The senator's villa lies in the fashionable district where Rome's political elite maintain their primary residences. Your advanced reconnaissance has identified the household routine, guard positions, and architectural features that will facilitate tonight's operation. Roman speculators plan missions with the same attention to detail that engineers apply to siege warfare, leaving nothing to chance that might compromise imperial objectives. Your approach relies on intelligence gathered by fellow agents who spent weeks infiltrating Silanus's household as servants, craftsmen, and traders. The emperor maintains an extensive network of informants throughout Roman society, making it virtually impossible for anyone to plot against imperial interests without detection. What most citizens don't realize is that the empire operates a surveillance state that would impress modern secret police organizations. The killing itself must appear spontaneous while following carefully planned procedures. Silanus will be stabbed in a pattern consistent with street robbery, but the wounds must be positioned to ensure rapid death while avoiding excessive blood that might complicate the staging. Your training included detailed instruction in anatomy, specifically focused on techniques for causing death that mimics common criminal violence. The psychological preparation for speculator operations involves systematic desensitization to human suffering that begins with observation and progresses through increasingly active participation. New recruits watch executions, then assist with interrogations, then participate in arrests, and finally conduct solo missions under supervision. The process gradually erodes normal human empathy, while building professional detachment necessary for state-sanctioned murder. What makes imperial assassination particularly disturbing is its bureaucratic character. Every mission requires written authorization from the emperor or his designated representatives, detailed planning documents, and post-operation reports that become part of official records. The empire maintains archives documenting political murders that span centuries, treating assassination as a normal governmental function requiring proper documentation. The broader context of your work involves maintaining imperial power through systematic terror directed at the educated classes. Senators, writers, philosophers, and other intellectuals represent potential sources of opposition that must be controlled through fear rather than legal mechanisms. The speculators serve as instruments of that control, eliminating threats while maintaining the legal fiction that the emperor rules through law rather than violence. Your equipment tonight includes tools designed specifically for imperial operations. Daggers crafted to mimic weapons used by common criminals, clothing that won't identify you as military personnel, and substances that can simulate robbery motives by making the scene appear focused on theft rather than assassination. Everything has been designed to support the political narrative that will follow Silanus's death. The target's household presents typical challenges for imperial operations in urban settings. Servants might witness activity, neighbors could report unusual sounds, and physical evidence might contradict the desired narrative if improperly managed. Roman speculators train extensively in crime scene manipulation, learning to create evidence that supports political objectives while eliminating traces that might reveal imperial involvement. As you approach the villa's rear entrance, you're acutely aware that tonight's mission represents the application of absolute power unconstrained by legal or moral limitations. The Emperor can order anyone's death for any reason, and his speculators exist to implement those orders with professional efficiency. You've become an instrument of tyranny that operates beyond any system of accountability or restraint. The killing proceeds exactly as planned. Silanus dies quickly. The scene is staged to suggest robbery, and you disappear into Rome's labyrinthine streets without leaving traces that could compromise future operations. Tomorrow, the city will learn of another tragic crime that claims a prominent citizen's life, and the Emperor will publicly express appropriate grief, while privately celebrating the elimination of a political irritant. Back in your quarters beneath the Palatine, you file a detailed report documenting the mission's success while already reviewing plans for next week's assignment. The Empire's appetite for political murder is insatiable, and your services are constantly in demand. You've become living proof that absolute power creates institutions dedicated to the systematic application of lethal force as routine governmental procedure. The most disturbing realization is that you've learned to take professional pride in work that represents the complete abandonment of human decency. The Empire has created a system that rewards expertise in murder and celebrates competence in the application of terror. Tonight's successful mission will advance your career within an organization dedicated to the systematic destruction of anyone who threatens imperial interests. Roman medicines dance with death and torture. You enter the Valetudinarium, the military hospital at Vindobona, just after dawn, 166 AD, carrying a leather satchel filled with surgical instruments that would horrify modern physicians. As medicus ordinarius responsible for treating both wounded soldiers and extracting information from captured barbarian prisoners, you occupy a unique position in Roman military medicine that blends healing with systematic brutality. Today's schedule includes amputating a legionnaire's crushed leg without anesthesia, performing experimental surgery on captured Germanic warriors, and demonstrating anatomical techniques using condemned prisoners as living teaching aids. Roman medical knowledge has reached remarkable sophistication through practices that violate every conceivable ethical standard. Military physicians learn human anatomy by dissecting prisoners of war, test surgical techniques on slaves who can't refuse participation, and develop pharmaceutical knowledge through forced experimentation on subjects whose consent is neither sought nor required. The Empire has created a medical establishment that advances scientific understanding through the systematic torture of human subjects. Your morning begins with examining Gaius Valerius Maximus, a veteran of the Germanic campaigns who suffered severe leg trauma when his horse fell during yesterday's skirmish. The wound has become infected overnight, and amputation offers his only chance of survival. Roman surgery proceeds without effective pain relief. Alcohol provides minimal dulling of sensation, while opium remains expensive and reserved for officers. The patient will be restrained with leather straps while conscious during the entire procedure. The amputation process reveals Roman medicine's combination of advanced technique and barbaric execution. Your surgical instruments are remarkably sophisticated. Bronze scalpels honed to razor sharpness, bone saws designed for efficient cutting, and cauteries heated to precise temperatures for sealing blood vessels. The procedures themselves demonstrate anatomical knowledge that won't be matched until the Renaissance, but they're performed with a casual disregard for patient suffering that reflects Rome's fundamental attitude toward human pain. Maximus remains conscious throughout the operation, his screams echoing through the hospital ward as you methodically cut through muscle, sever bone, and cauterize bleeding vessels. Other patients watch the procedure with fascination and terror, knowing they might face similar treatment if their own wounds worsen. Roman military medicine operates on the principle that soldiers are equipment to be repaired or discarded based on their continued usefulness to imperial objectives. The afternoon brings more disturbing responsibilities, interrogating captured prisoners through medical procedures designed to extract military intelligence. Roman physicians have developed techniques that exploit anatomical knowledge to maximize pain while maintaining the subject's capacity for speech. These methods aren't crude torture. They're sophisticated applications of medical science, directed toward breaking human resistance through calculated manipulation of physiological responses. Your first subject is a Germanic chieftain captured during the recent border raids, suspected of knowing troop movements and supply routes that could prove valuable for future Roman operations. Standard interrogation has failed, requiring medical intervention that will either produce useful intelligence or provide valuable anatomical experience. Roman law makes no distinction between legitimate medical practice and interrogational torture when applied to enemies of the state. The interrogation chamber has been equipped with medical instruments that serve dual purposes. They function as surgical tools while creating psychological pressure on subjects who understand their potential for inflicting precise, controlled suffering. Roman physicians have learned to read physiological signs that indicate approaching psychological breakdown, allowing them to maintain optimal pressure without accidentally causing premature death or unconsciousness. The techniques you apply combine medical knowledge with systematic cruelty in ways that maximize both information extraction and scientific learning. Pressure applied to specific nerve clusters can create excruciating pain without visible injury, while controlled blood loss weakens resistance without immediately threatening life. Roman military medicine has transformed torture into a clinical procedure that advances both intelligence gathering and anatomical understanding. What makes Roman medical torture particularly horrific is its scientific precision. Physicians document which techniques prove most effective on different subject types, compile data on pain tolerance variations among different ethnic groups, and develop pharmaceutical approaches to maintain consciousness during extended interrogation sessions. The empire treats torture as a research opportunity that contributes to broader medical knowledge. The prisoners' responses provide valuable data for medical advancement that will benefit future Roman military operations. You're learning how different psychological pressures affect physiological functions, mapping pain responses that reveal previously unknown neural pathways, and developing pharmaceutical combinations that optimize subject compliance. Tonight's interrogation will be documented in medical texts that will influence Roman practice for generations. Between interrogation sessions, you conduct anatomical demonstrations for medical students using condemned criminals who've been designated for educational purposes. These subjects are dissected while alive, allowing observation of functioning organs and physiological processes that can't be studied in corpses. Roman medical education depends on access to human subjects whose lives are considered expendable for scientific advancement. The students gathered around today's demonstration subject, a captured Dacian warrior condemned for rebellion. Take careful notes as you expose functioning internal organs while maintaining the subject's consciousness through carefully administered stimulants. They're learning anatomy, physiology, and surgical technique through direct observation of human suffering, orchestrated for educational benefit. Evening brings the most disturbing aspect of Roman military medicine: experimental surgery performed on subjects who serve as test cases for techniques that might eventually be applied to Roman soldiers. Tonight's subject is a captured Germanic woman who will undergo experimental procedures designed to test new methods for treating battlefield injuries. Her survival is irrelevant. Her usefulness lies in providing data that might save Roman lives in future conflicts. The experimental surgery proceeds with the same systematic approach that characterizes all Roman medical practice. You test new suturing techniques, experiment with different approaches to treating internal injuries, and document which procedures show promise for future development. The subject's agony provides valuable information about pain responses that will inform pharmaceutical research designed to improve battlefield medicine. As you complete tonight's documentation and clean instruments for tomorrow's procedures, you're struck by the realization that Roman medicine has achieved remarkable advancement through the systematic exploitation of human subjects who lack any legal protection or meaningful consent. The Empire has created a medical establishment that treats scientific progress as justification for unlimited experimentation on conquered peoples. Your professional success depends on expertise and procedures that combine healing knowledge with torturous application, advancing medical science through practices that reduce human beings to experimental material. The Empire has transformed medicine from a healing art into an instrument of both physical restoration and systematic brutality, and you've become its most skilled practitioner. The machinery of child sacrifice in imperial religion. You stand before the underground altar in the Taurobolium chamber beneath Rome. 194 AD, as priest Maximus Cornelius Severus prepares for tonight's sacred ceremony honoring Magna Mater. The ritual requires the sacrifice of 3 children, captives taken during recent campaigns in Germania, whose blood will ensure imperial favor and military success in the coming season. As assistant to the high priest, you're responsible for preparing the victims and ensuring that their deaths occur according to precise religious specifications that transform murder into sacred duty. Roman religion operates on the principle that gods demand blood in exchange for earthly favors, and children represent the most valuable offerings because their innocence amplifies the spiritual power generated through their destruction. The Empire has systematized child sacrifice through religious institutions that provide theological justification for practices that even contemporary pagans from other cultures would consider abhorrent. Tonight's ceremony isn't primitive barbarism, it's sophisticated religious theater designed to channel divine power toward imperial objectives. The children, 2 boys aged 8 and 10 and a girl of 7, have been held in temple chambers for 9 days, purified through ritual bathing and fed sacred foods that prepare their bodies for divine consumption. They understand what awaits them. Germanic tribes teach children about Roman religious practices as warnings about the civilization that threatens their way of life. Their terror serves ritual purposes, as fear-induced adrenaline is believed to enhance the spiritual potency of their blood. The sacrificial chamber has been carved from solid rock beneath the temple complex, creating an acoustic environment that amplifies both screams and prayers while ensuring that sounds don't carry to unauthorized listeners above. The walls are lined with religious imagery that depicts the gods consuming human offerings, while drainage channels carry blood to sacred pools where it's collected for future magical applications. Roman engineers have applied their architectural expertise to optimize the spiritual efficiency of ritualized murder. Your responsibilities include restraining the victims during the preliminary ceremonies that precede their actual deaths. This involves more than simple physical control. The children must remain conscious and aware throughout prayers, invocations, and ritual preparations that can last several hours. Roman religious law requires that sacrificial victims understand their role in cosmic transactions between humanity and divinity, making their terror an essential component of successful ceremonies. The theological justification for child sacrifice rests on Roman interpretations of divine justice that view conquered peoples as cosmic criminals, whose deaths atone for their resistance to imperial authority. The gods supposedly demand payment for barbarian offenses against Roman civilization, and children represent ideal currency for these spiritual transactions because their deaths generate maximum divine attention. The Empire has created religious frameworks that transform genocide into pious duty. The actual killing follows procedures that Roman priests have refined through centuries of practice. Each child must die in a specific manner that corresponds to particular divine preferences. The younger boy will be drowned in sacred water to honor Neptune. The older boy will be burned alive for Jupiter, and the girl will have her heart removed while beating to satisfy Magna Mater's appetite for ultimate offerings. The precision required demonstrates how thoroughly Rome has bureaucratized the process of murdering children. Priest Severus begins with invocations that invoke divine attention, while establishing the spiritual context for tonight's offerings. The Latin prayers are beautiful in their linguistic sophistication, transforming descriptions of child murder into elegant religious poetry that masks the horror through aesthetic refinement. Roman religious language has evolved to make atrocity sound sacred, creating cognitive distance between ceremonial requirements and moral reality. The first death proceeds exactly as prescribed by religious tradition. The younger boy is held beneath sacred water, while priests chant prayers that theoretically transform drowning into divine communion. His struggles are interpreted as spiritual ecstasy rather than terror, while his death agony becomes evidence of successful divine communication. Roman theology has developed sophisticated methods for reinterpreting human suffering as religious transcendence. The second killing requires more elaborate preparation, as the older boy is positioned over sacred flames that will consume him, slowly enough to maximize his conscious participation in the offering. Roman religious practices emphasize the spiritual value of prolonged dying that allows maximum divine appreciation of human sacrifice. The child's screams are considered prayers that carry special power because they emerge from ultimate suffering. The final sacrifice involves surgical precision that demonstrates Roman medical knowledge applied to religious purposes. The girl must remain conscious while her chest is opened and her heart removed, requiring careful application of stimulants and restraints that maintain awareness during procedures that would normally cause immediate unconsciousness. Roman priests have learned anatomical techniques that maximize the spiritual power generated through controlled human destruction. The hearts collected during tonight's ceremony will be preserved for future magical applications, divination rituals that predict military outcomes, protective charms for imperial officials, and pharmaceutical preparations that transfer the children's life force to Roman recipients. The empire has developed systematic methods for harvesting and utilizing spiritual energy extracted through ritualized murder. The aftermath involves disposing of the bodies in ways that prevent contamination of sacred spaces while ensuring that their deaths continue generating spiritual benefits for Roman interests. The remains will be buried in locations that channel their residual life force toward imperial objectives, creating permanent sources of divine favor that persist long after the victims' deaths. What makes Roman child sacrifice particularly disturbing is its integration into broader imperial policies that view conquered populations as resources to be exploited for spiritual as well as economic purposes. Children taken during military campaigns serve multiple functions. They provide slave labor, generate revenue through sales, and supply ritual requirements that maintain divine support for continued conquest. The empire has created systems that monetize every aspect of human destruction. The religious establishment that facilitates child sacrifice operates with full imperial support and legal protection that places it beyond any form of accountability or restraint. Priests who specialize in human offerings enjoy high social status and substantial economic benefits derived from their expertise in ritualized murder. Roman society rewards competence in the systematic destruction of children through religious institutions that celebrate such skills as expressions of piety. As you clean ritual implements and prepare documentation of tonight's successful ceremony, you're struck by the realization that you've participated in murders that Roman law not only permits, but mandates as religious obligations. The empire has created theological frameworks that make child sacrifice a patriotic duty, and you've become an instrument of systematic infanticide disguised as spiritual devotion. Tonight's work will be recorded in temple archives that document centuries of human offerings, tracking their effectiveness in generating divine favor and refining techniques based on observed spiritual results. You're contributing to an institutional knowledge base that systematizes child murder as routine religious practice, and your professional advancement depends on demonstrated competence in the theological destruction of innocence. The fall of Rome, cannibalism, plague, and civilization's collapse. you huddle in the ruins of what was once the Forum Romanum, 476 AD, gnawing on a piece of meat that you desperately hope came from one of the city's remaining horses rather than from your neighbor, who disappeared 3 days ago. As one of the few remaining imperial administrators still attempting to maintain civil order in a Rome that's collapsing into apocalyptic chaos, you've witnessed the transformation of the world's greatest civilization into a nightmare of starvation, disease, and systematic cannibalism that makes previous Roman brutalities seem almost merciful by comparison. The siege has lasted 8 months, with Odoacer's Germanic forces controlling every road, aqueduct, and supply line leading to the city. Rome's population has dropped from over 1 million to perhaps 50,000, with most of the reduction coming not from military casualties, but from starvation, plague, and the casual murder that occurs when civilization's restraints dissolve completely. The streets that once echoed with the footsteps of conquering legions now reek of decomposing corpses and the smoke from cooking. Fires that consume increasingly questionable fuel. Your official responsibilities theoretically include maintaining records of grain distribution, organizing civilian defense, and preserving governmental continuity during the current crisis. In practice, you spend most days deciding which sections of the city to abandon to plague victims, mediating disputes over access to human remains, and trying to prevent the complete breakdown of social order that would transform. Rome's death throws into pure chaos rather than merely organized desperation. The food situation has progressed through predictable stages of societal collapse. First, the wealthy consumed their hoarded supplies while poor districts starved. Then, systematic hunting eliminated every animal within the city walls. Horses, dogs, cats, rats, and eventually insects disappeared into cooking pots. Tree bark and leather provided temporary sustenance before hunger drove Romans to cross the final moral boundary that separates civilization from barbarism. The cannibalism began with corpses, plague victims, and starvation casualties who died of natural causes became sources of meat for survivors who'd abandoned ethical constraints in favor of biological imperatives. But as fresh corpses became scarce and existing bodies decomposed beyond edibility, some Romans progressed to murder specifically for food. The city's remaining population has divided into hunters and prey, with strength determining which category each person occupies. You've documented cases that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Parents consuming their own children, organized groups that hunt isolated individuals for food, and systematic butchering operations that process human bodies with the efficiency that Romans once applied to cattle. The transformation from imperial citizens to cannibalistic scavengers occurred gradually, each moral compromise making the next transgression easier to rationalize. The plague compounds every other horror by creating conditions that accelerate social breakdown while providing convenient cover for murder. Symptoms include fever, swollen lymph nodes, and skin lesions that turn victims into walking advertisements for approaching death. But plague also creates opportunities for those strong enough to exploit others' weakness. Infected individuals can be murdered without moral qualms since they're dying anyway, while their possessions and flesh become available for appropriation. The city's infrastructure has collapsed completely, creating sanitary conditions that would horrify even Roman slaves. The aqueducts stopped flowing months ago, forcing survivors to collect rainwater and drink from sources contaminated with human waste and decomposing bodies. The sewer system has backed up, turning low-lying areas into pools of sewage that breed disease while making entire districts uninhabitable. Religious institutions have either fled the city or transformed into organizations that facilitate rather than constrain the breakdown of moral order. Some priests have embraced theological interpretations that justify cannibalism as divine punishment for imperial sins, while others have organized congregations around ritual consumption of human flesh that they claim possesses sacramental properties. Roman religious creativity has found ways to make barbarism seem sacred. The remaining governmental structure operates through pure violence, with official authority extending only as far as immediate physical power can enforce it. Legal systems have collapsed entirely, replaced by tribal arrangements where groups organize around access to resources and protection from other survivors. You maintain your administrative position not through legal authority, but because your knowledge of the city's layout and remaining supplies makes you valuable to whatever faction currently controls your district. Military units that haven't deserted or died have devolved into organized bandit groups that prey on civilian survivors while nominally maintaining imperial allegiance. Soldiers have discovered that their training and equipment make them ideally suited for hunting human prey, and their professional knowledge of violence provides significant advantages in Rome's new economy of predation and survival. The most disturbing aspect of Rome's collapse is how quickly civilizational values have disappeared under survival pressure. People who once debated philosophy and poetry now spend their days plotting to murder neighbors for food, while intellectual achievements that took centuries to develop have been forgotten in favor of practical knowledge about butchering human bodies and avoiding disease transmission through cannibalistic consumption. Foreign observers who witness Rome's final agonies document a civilization that's consuming itself in the most literal sense possible. The city that once ruled the known world has become a charnel house where survivors compete for access to human flesh while maintaining the pretense that they're preserving Roman culture and values. The empire's final legacy isn't architectural monuments or legal systems, but the demonstration that any civilization can devolve into cannibalistic barbarism given sufficient pressure. You've begun keeping detailed records of the city's collapse, partly from administrative habit and partly from the hope that future generations might learn from Rome's example. But your documentation increasingly resembles horror stories rather than historical accounts. Descriptions of systematic murder, recipes for preparing human meat, and survival strategies that assume the complete abandonment of moral restraints. As winter approaches and the siege continues, you're faced with the realization that you've survived the fall of the greatest empire in human history by participating in practices that reduce humans to sources of nutrition. The transformation from imperial administrator to cannibalistic scavenger occurred so gradually that you barely noticed crossing moral boundaries that once seemed absolute. Tonight, you'll huddle around a fire fueled by furniture taken from abandoned palaces, eating meat of questionable origin while planning tomorrow's search for additional food sources that might or might not be human. The Eternal City has become a temporary hell, and you've become living proof that civilization is far more fragile than anyone imagined. The legacy of Roman brutality echoes through history. You stand in the ruins of the Colosseum at sunset, 1453 AD, nearly 1,000 years after Rome's fall, as Turkish cannons echo across the Bosphorus, announcing Constantinople's capture. As a Venetian scholar documenting the final collapse of the Byzantine Empire, Rome's last surviving remnant, you're witnessing the end of a civilization that began with systematic brutality and concluded with the same casual violence that characterized its entire existence. The Roman legacy isn't architecture or law. It's the demonstration that organized societies can systematize human suffering on unprecedented scales while maintaining cultural sophistication that masks underlying moral bankruptcy. Your research into Roman historical records has revealed patterns of institutionalized cruelty that provided templates for subsequent civilizations seeking to optimize the application of terror as governmental policy. The techniques developed by Roman torturers, executioners, and slave traders have been refined and adapted by medieval inquisitors, Renaissance princes, and modern totalitarian states that recognize the effectiveness of Roman innovations in systematic human destruction. The documentation you've compiled demonstrates how Roman methods for controlling populations through fear became standard practices throughout European history. Medieval kingdoms adopted Roman approaches to public execution, maintaining the theatrical elements that transform individual deaths into collective psychological manipulation. The Inquisition borrowed Roman interrogation techniques, adapting classical torture methods for religious rather than political purposes, while preserving the essential elements that make systematic brutality effective. Colonial expansion has carried Roman precedents to new continents, where European powers apply classical techniques for subjugating indigenous populations through calculated terror. The Spanish conquest of the Americas follows Roman patterns of systematic enslavement, mass execution, and cultural destruction that transform entire civilizations into resources for imperial exploitation. Roman innovations in genocide have proven remarkably adaptable to different cultural contexts and technological capabilities. The slave trade that connects Africa, Europe, and the Americas operates through institutions that directly descend from Roman practices, using the same legal frameworks that classify human beings as property, while developing industrial-scale systems for processing people as commodities. Roman slave markets provided organizational models that modern traders have expanded into global enterprises that reduce millions of Africans to economic units in imperial commerce. Your historical analysis reveals how Roman religious practices that sanctified violence have influenced subsequent spiritual traditions that embrace systematic cruelty as expressions of divine will. Christian crusades, Islamic conquests, and various religious wars have adopted Roman techniques for transforming mass murder into sacred duty while developing theological justifications that make genocide seem pious rather than criminal. The legal systems that emerge from Roman law contain embedded assumptions about human value that facilitate the systematic oppression of designated groups while maintaining the fiction that such treatment represents justice rather than organized criminality. Roman precedents for excluding categories of people from legal protection have provided foundations for subsequent legal structures that institutionalize discrimination and violence. The artistic traditions that celebrate Roman achievements consistently ignore or romanticize the brutality that made imperial greatness possible, creating cultural narratives that transform perpetrators of systematic atrocity into heroes worthy of emulation. Renaissance art, neoclassical architecture, and Enlightenment philosophy draw inspiration from Roman models, while carefully avoiding examination of the moral costs that Roman achievements required. Your documentation includes eyewitness accounts from throughout Roman history that describe the systematic application of torture, execution, and enslavement with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized all imperial operations. These sources reveal how thoroughly Rome had normalized practices that subsequent civilizations would adopt as standard governmental procedures, creating historical precedents for state-sponsored terrorism that continue influencing political structures. The technological innovations that Romans developed for optimizing human suffering have been adapted by subsequent civilizations that recognize the utility of Roman engineering applied to systematic brutality. Medieval siege weapons, Renaissance torture devices, and modern concentration camps all incorporate design principles that Romans pioneered for maximizing the efficiency of organized violence. The psychological techniques that Roman institutions used for conditioning individuals to participate in systematic cruelty have become standard methods for training military personnel, police forces, and other agents of state violence who require desensitization to human suffering. Roman innovations in psychological manipulation provide templates that modern governments use for creating compliant populations and eliminating resistance to official policies. Educational systems throughout European history have transmitted Roman values that emphasize imperial glory while minimizing awareness of the human costs that such achievements required. Classical education creates cultural elites who identify with Roman ideals without fully comprehending the systematic brutality that made those ideals possible, perpetuating cycles of violence that continue Roman traditions under different names. The economic structures that emerged from Roman precedents continue operating through institutions that treat human beings as resources to be exploited for maximum profit while maintaining legal and cultural frameworks that justify such treatment as natural or inevitable. Roman innovations and systematic exploitation have provided foundations for capitalist systems that reduce workers to economic units while preserving the fiction that such arrangements represent voluntary agreements. As you complete your documentation while Constantinople burns in the distance, you're struck by the realization that Roman civilization's most enduring legacy isn't its positive achievements, but its demonstration that sophisticated societies can systematize barbarism while maintaining cultural sophistication that obscures underlying moral corruption. Every subsequent civilization has borrowed Roman techniques for organizing violence while adopting Roman methods for disguising brutality as necessity or virtue. The scholarly tradition that you represent has consistently failed to confront the full implications of Roman precedents, preferring to celebrate imperial achievements while treating systematic cruelty as unfortunate byproducts rather than essential features of imperial success. Academic institutions continue transmitting Roman values while avoiding serious examination of the moral frameworks that made Roman brutality seem acceptable to contemporary participants. Tonight, as you prepare final revisions to your historical analysis, you're forced to acknowledge that your own civilization has inherited and refined Roman techniques for systematic human destruction while developing even more sophisticated methods for disguising such practices as expressions of cultural advancement. The Roman legacy lives on in every institution that treats human suffering as acceptable cost for achieving political or economic objectives. The most disturbing realization is that you've spent years documenting Roman brutality while living in a world that has successfully exceeded Roman achievements in systematic cruelty through innovations that Romans could never have imagined. The techniques they pioneered for organizing violence have been refined by subsequent civilizations that possess technological capabilities for implementing brutality on scales that would have awed Roman emperors. Your work stands as testimony to the dangerous persistence of Roman precedents that continue influencing human behavior long after the civilization that created them has disappeared into historical memory. The Eternal City's most lasting contribution to human development has been the demonstration that any society can systematize barbarism while maintaining the cultural sophistication necessary to make such practices seem normal, necessary, or even noble.